Tego Sewa Guego. My name's Heather George. I'm the Executive Director for Woodland Cultural Center. I think part of the reason it's so important for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to learn about Diskahe Levi General is that it shows that for, well over 100 years, Haudenosaunee people have been asserting their sovereignty and their nationhood, and not even just in sort of what we might call like a Canadian or a nationalistic context, but certainly internationally and beyond Canada and the United States to the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations. In the mid-1800s, the entire community had sort of been relocated to where it is today. So of course, less land for people. There was a lot of theft of lumber by settlers. And to this day, Six Nations is a really important Carolinian forest zone. So of course, we want to look after the trees, both because they provide, back then especially, heating for our homes, but also we rely on them to build our homes. We rely on them to support the ecosystem. So there's those environmental factors. There is, of course, the imposition of the Indian Act much before this, but by this point in time in the 1920s, that is really affecting things like decisions around education, healthcare. There's a position created called an Indian agent, and they have so much control over people's lives within Indigenous communities. And so in 1923, there's a study done by someone named Colonel Thompson for the federal government. And that study is actually what's used to justify the first election happening. The Confederacy sees all of these things going on and all this change happening and all this pressure from the federal government. And they realize that they really need to do something to not just document how the Confederacy works, which they do start to do, but also to assert their nationhood and their relationship to other nations. Following the First World War, we have the development of the League of Nations, which eventually becomes the United Nations. And so all of these little nations who have felt this pressure and conflict of the war are getting together, and they're trying to build this organization that will keep that conflict from happening. And of course, we know through history that didn't really happen. There's the Second World War and many conflicts after that. But I think the Confederacy saw that as an opportunity to say, like, oh, these other little nations, Ireland, Panama, Estonia, tiny, tiny nations, are being recognized by these other bigger global nations, the United Kingdom, Britain, the United States, like all these other places. We want to be recognized too, and we want to make sure that we have our rights upheld in the same way as any other nation. And so the Confederacy decides that they will send someone to do this work, and that ends up being Diskahe Levi General. And so he first actually travels to England in 1921 to petition the then King of England for our rights, our treaty rights, and to say, like, hey, like this military force, the RCMP, have been put in our community, and our money that we use to do all these important things has been frozen. Canada is oppressing us. And he doesn't get an audience with the king, so that's when he decides to work with a lawyer. The Confederacy decides they'll work with a lawyer, George P. Decker from Rochester, and the recommendation is made to go to the League of Nations. And so Diskahe produces a report. It's called the Red Man's Appeal for Justice. He brings that to the League of Nations, and Canada isn't a nation yet in the League of Nations. England is. And all of this really ruffles the feathers in Ottawa of folks like Duncan Campbell Scott. And so what they do is, through a lot of backroom politics, they convince England essentially to suppress this appeal that Diskahe is making. And so he never actually gets to speak at the League of Nations, but the mayor of Geneva finds out about this and arranges for Diskahe to speak publicly to the citizens of Geneva. And so he does that in a big community hall. And again, the media is there. He ends up speaking in all these places throughout Europe, Bern and Lucerne, Paris even, and becomes this big media sensation. And so, here's Canada trying to make sure nobody finds out what's going on, and, we're the good guys. And Descahi's out there being like, well, we have this political system, our women have a role in politics, and even saying this to Europeans who, in many cases, women in Europe didn't have the right to vote. And he's saying, like, this paramilitary force has been put in our community, and we have all these treaties, and they are not being upheld. He does finally, return after speaking, but it is recommended by his lawyer that he not come back to Canada. So his lawyer, Decker, recommends to him that he come back through the United States. And we don't know for sure, but we think it's because they were worried he was going to be charged with treason upon returning to Canada. And so he returns back. He ends up in Rochester for a little bit, and then staying at the home of Clinton Rickard in Lewiston, from the Tuscarora Nation. And he actually ends up passing away there, having never come back to Canada. And just to sort of really make matters worse, Canada and the United States work together, not just to, sort of prevent him from coming back, but while he's, quite ill and his family wants to go and see him, and they want to send, a primary healthcare practitioner, a medicine man, to go see him. The United States imposes the 1921 Immigration Act improperly on them. And the 1921 Immigration Act said that if you were illiterate, you could not cross the border into the United States. And so they used that act to prevent his family and his healthcare providers from going to see him. And he passes away at Clinton Rickard's home. Eventually, his body is brought back to Six Nations, and ceremony and burial is held for him. And the Indian agent behind all of this, Colonel Morgan, my goodness, what a guy, still shows up at that funeral. So Ottawa and its representatives did everything they could to prevent him from sharing his message and from people being aware of what was happening in this community and to Indigenous people. Descahi's work, of course, was important in its own time period. But to this day, the United Nations recognizes him as the first Indigenous person to attempt to petition the League of Nations. Following his work, a series of meetings were held at the United Nations in the 1970s and 80s, and delegations, Haudenosaunee delegations, went to these meetings. The meetings eventually resulted in the establishment of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and one of the people who has really, I would say, continued Levi General Descahi's work is Kenneth Deere through the Haudenosaunee External Relations Committee. Their work, both in the 70s and 80s, 90s, and even into today, and this lobbying that they're doing at that body, it results in the creation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One of the really interesting things about Levi General Descahi, the way he did his work, and also the way the Confederacy did their work, is that they didn't just place it within sort of like a Western legal context, or say like, okay, the Canadian Constitution says this or whatever, right? They placed it within a Haudenosaunee legal context. Descahi traveled with two wampum belts. He traveled with the two-row wampum, or Goswenta, that most people are pretty familiar with, and also a covenant chain or friendship belt, which is a belt that has two characters or two figures on it, one representing Europeans and one representing Indigenous or Haudenosaunee people, with this chain that connects them. And I think one of the things people sometimes forget about with wampum belts is that each belt builds on the previous one. So we don't go like, here's the two-row wampum, and that's in isolation. And here's Dish with One Spoon, and that's in isolation. And here's Covenant Chain, that's in isolation. They're all building on each other, right? So we're looking at this relationally as a continuation of a relationship. Metaphorically, when we think about this silver covenant chain and this responsibility of those two partners to polish the chain, to renew those relationships, to continually be in relation with each other, that's a really important legal construct, which quite frankly, Canada has abandoned, has ignored. But just because Canada has ignored it doesn't mean it's not there, right? So we go back, even within Canada's own laws, to Section 35 of the Constitution that says Canada being created didn't remove those legal structures. And we are seeing this in current court cases. There's been 2 court cases recently in the Quebec Supreme Court that actually upheld the two-row wampum as a legal structure. So when I think about the Silver Covenant chain and the work that England and Canada did to prevent Descahe from speaking at the League of Nations, I think that is one of the most obvious and blatant examples of not even just forgetting that you have a treaty relationship with someone, like actually breaking the treaty relationship with someone, to like completely ignoring it. And if you look at sort of the historical progression of the relationship with Indigenous peoples, it's very easy to be cynical and to see how, as long as we have been needed or the land we're on is needed, then the relationship is good, right? Then it's strong. But when our population becomes smaller, or when Canada doesn't care how it looks on the global stage, then it's very easy to violate Indigenous rights. It's very easy to forget about treaty agreements. And I think we are in a very precarious time, politically and globally, where it's very easy for Canada and very easy for the world, quite frankly, to ignore Indigenous rights. That history is a direct link to the present that we're in right now and the creation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And for Indigenous students, I think it uplifts them. It allows them to see that we have this history of supporting our rights, globally. And I think for non-Indigenous students, it helps them to understand their responsibilities as Canadian citizens to things like the United Nations Declaration and to the Canadian Constitution, and how Indigenous rights are both recognized at the state level, but how Indigenous people view those rights as well.